Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 1 cheat sheet for the Defenders. The cheat sheet series, if you haven't been watching my videos lately, is a ranking of all the positions in FPL, specifically looking at each budget category, which are the best players to look at, from differential assets to things or to players that I think are the absolute best in the game right now, based on our current understanding of the Game Week 1 landscape. As far as defenses, I think one thing to look at before we look at individual defenders is to just simply look at team defenses last season and just simply have a brief review of the key defenses in the previous year. As far as defenses, I think it's worth actually tiering them into 4 categories. However, I've actually left them in 3 for this sort of graphic here. City should really be in a tier of their own, but I've actually put them next to Newcastle and Arsenal, who were the second and third best defenses in the league, both in terms of expected goals conceded, which is effectively looking at your opponent's expected goals conceded and seeing how much XG they attained versus you over the course of the season throughout all your games, compared to actual goals conceded, which is that GC stat, as you can see on the screen. XGC rank and GC rank is just where these teams ranked in terms of their peers within the league. Overperformance and underperformance is just simply your GC stat minus your XGC stat. So if you overperformed in terms of goals conceded, I would have actually shown that within a positive stat. If you underperformed, let's say you conceded a lot more goals than you should have based on your expectations, then you would have underperformed, which is a negative here. As far as the green teams, of course, these are the best teams in the Premier League from a defensive point of view. I think Arsenal in particular actually had a bit of a skid when Saliba was injured, so you could even contextualize them as a better defense. As far as the next category, you can see that there's a very small margin of expected goals conceded difference between the top team here in Crystal Palace and West Ham here. 48.1 to 53.0 expected goals conceded. You can see there's a huge drop off between a Crystal Palace and an Arsenal as well, around 6. So this bracket of teams is what I would call the mid-table in terms of defensive quality. Now, this will obviously be impacted by some defensive signings. So, for example, a team like United or Liverpool or even Chelsea could be bolstering their team. Even Aston Villa have rumored to be signing Pau Torres. So that's going to have a huge impact in terms of the quality of the defense. However, one thing that I would say is that the top teams in this bracket are still very respectable defenses, and there's nothing really wrong with picking players from this category. What I would look at as well is who are the key overperformers and underperformers. So as you can see, Tottenham actually had a huge underperformance last year, and that actually probably suggests that Tottenham had an unlucky year when it comes to goals conceded, but also there might be some external factors, like how poor Lloris was as a keeper. With United, we saw a bit of overperformance, although I think I would attribute that simply to how good they are at home. Now that fans are back, we are starting to see a bit more of a difference between home and away and how impactful that is to your defensive quality. As far as Aston Villa, they've had another year where they've overperformed their expectations, and I do think with some defensive improvements, they're a good team to look at as well. I would say that here, Brentford and Brighton are teams that definitely surprised us and that they were very consistent year on year. So these are teams that I would say I would have a bit more faith in. Whereas with Liverpool and Chelsea, we saw a gigantic drop off from what they actually got as expected goals conceded last season to this. However, of course, when it came to actual expectations, I don't think there was a shocking change between Liverpool and Chelsea. They did dramatically decrease as a quality defense this year, although I do think we can expect them to improve. With Tottenham, I would say, because they were so unlucky, they're definitely a team to look at, because I don't think their actual defensive team or the defensive lineup as it stands is actually as bad as it looks. They definitely wouldn't be in my sort of bottom 5 teams in the Premier League, at least from a defensive point of view. And then you see that third tier here, which is effectively teams that have, once again, a huge drop off between a West Ham and a Wolves, between those brackets where you have a effectively 7 expected goal difference. And then you actually look at a team like Leeds, which has, once again, another 7 expected goal difference between Wolves. Now, of course, that suggests that teams like, let's say, Bournemouth, Nottingham Forest, Everton, and Leeds United were particularly poor in defense. But overall, most of the teams within this category were poor defenses. And it's no surprise that the relegated teams were actually here in terms of Southampton, Leicester City, and Leeds United. But also that some of the promoted teams from last season were here too. And that's actually a good expectation to set for ourselves for the teams coming up this season. Luton United, Burnley, and even Sheffield United are probably teams that I would expect to be in this bracket once again. And for that reason, I wouldn't really rate a defender coming from this sort of bracket of team, because you don't get the benefit of extra things like save points that a keeper would if he was playing in a particularly poor defense. So you'll see, for that reason, I don't really have many defenders from these teams. And the only outlier I would say is Burnley, because Burnley had really, really good expected goals conceded numbers in the championship and had a huge gulf between their peers that have actually joined the Premier League in terms of Luton Town and also Sheffield United, who are actually still the second and third best defensive teams within the championship. What's key here as well is Fulham was actually the team with the least amount of expected goals conceded the previous year when they promoted to the Premier League. And ultimately, they still had around expected goals conceded numbers like Luton Town did, like a Sheffield United did. It's only that Burnley, as I said, that appeared to be an outlier. So they're definitely a team to look for in the future. When we move on now towards the defenders, I think the key thing here is to look at what are the best budget defenders. And we've been provided with fantastic options so far. We actually have three arguably 4.0 effective options for now. We've got Bayer from Burnley, we've got Bell from Luton Town, and Baldock, who's the right wing back for Sheffield United. I put an asterisk around Baldock because for me, the key thing to look at here is that he might not get full-on minutes, although they don't really have a defensive replacement option at the right wing-back position at this time, so I do think Baldock will stay, and he potentially should be the best option. However, of course, transfers dependent, I do think that he could lose quite a few minutes. As far as Bell, I do expect Luton Town to be a slightly worse defense than Bayer, but Burnley's opening fixtures are probably the worst in terms of the three promoted teams, so that's actually one thing that makes it so interesting to actually go with any of these options. I think ultimately you pick one of the options between Baldock and Bayer, just simply because I don't have that much confidence in Luton Town, and at least with Baldock you have really high expected assists per 90 to actually fall back on, so slightly more appealing as an attacking option than Bell, because you're not really expecting many defensive returns from a quality team like this. As far as Bayer, it really just depends on how much you rate Burnley going ahead to the season. It's still going to be a huge task facing Premier League teams, and I don't think, for example, overperforming in the Championship is always going to be a telltale sign that you'll do well in the Premier League. Norwich have been a good example of that in years past. As far as the 4.5 tier, this is where things start to become interesting. I would say Henry and Botman are your two best picks. Why is that the case? Because Botman actually performed and played for one of the best defenses in the league last year in terms of Newcastle. So for that reason, I'm very interested in actually going for Botman to start the season if you really wanted to just pick a defender that would actually last you until a very late wildcard if you wanted to do that. However, I think Henry is a bit more prioritizing the early fixtures because Brentford have much better fixtures than a Newcastle. I mean, look at game weeks 2 and 3 for Newcastle. It's City and Liverpool. Those are two games where I don't really expect them to get clean sheets. Even Aston Villa to start the season is quite tough. Brentford actually don't face any of Arsenal, City, Liverpool, or Brighton in the opening 10 fixtures. So that's going to be a huge positive if you're looking at a player who can last you to that first wild card. So I do think Henry's quite interesting from that point of view. The one thing, of course, is that when we look at the keepers later, you might actually be looking at a Brentford keeper as well. So maybe there's no reason to double up there. As far as Agurd, I actually think he's a very interesting option because he actually plays for a top quality defense and he's not likely to be rotated. So Agurd is someone that I would say is going to be a starting quality center back for this West Ham team. And he had really, really good expected goals per 90 numbers from a center back, which clearly shows that he's very good at set pieces. And for that reason, I think he's a very interesting option. If we move on now to Ahmed Hodzic, the tricky thing here is that he's coming up from a promoted team, and I really don't expect much from promoted defenses. It's very hard to actually meet the demands of the Premier League, particularly from a defense point of view. We saw that a team like Fulham or even Bournemouth and Nottingham Forest, they really avoided promotion simply because their attack was good as opposed to their defense being good. So that's one of the issues there. And for that reason, even though his numbers are extremely appealing, like his expected assist numbers are very, very high, absurdly high actually for a center back, and his expected goals numbers are equally high as well. One of the best, as you can see in this cheat sheet. But that's the struggle I have with Sheffield United. If you want to go for them as a early sort of differential pick and then actually think about moving someone like the Sheffield United defender into a Newcastle defender later on because you want to avoid Newcastle's early bad fixtures, that actually could be a very good idea. And for that reason, I think he's a good differential. As far as Mings, he has very high ownership right now in FPL, but I think he is actually an option to avoid. Now, we have to sort of assess the preseason and hope that that actually gives us a bit of signs, but I do think the issue with Mings is that with Pau Torres coming back into the team, Diego Carlos coming back from injury, that's going to be a key thing to suggest that Mings might actually lose out in minutes and also his starting position for this season. And for that reason, I think he's going to be a bit of an avoid for now. As far as the 5.0 players, this is where we actually have a dearth of great options, and potentially all our teams should really be consisting of starting players within the 5.0 position, because you have some fantastic players here with fantastic price points. Estupiñán, for example, here with fantastic expected assist numbers, playing for a top quality defense in terms of Brighton, is definitely going to be interesting. He was absolutely nailed for the back half of last season under De Zerbi, so no real reason to move away from someone like Estupiñán, who actually probably is better than actually gambling at the goalkeeper situation at Brighton, given that they actually brought in a new Dutch goalkeeper to sort of compete with Steele. And at the same time, of course, I think his ownership being so high might actually tempt people to go to Estepinian just to not feel hurt by the mega hauls that he potentially can get. And we saw that he was a very attacking player last season as well. As far as Gabriel Zinchenko, I think they're fantastic options. We talked about how high quality of a defense this Arsenal team is. And for that reason, I think Gabriel is going to be one of the better options because his expected goal numbers for a center back are once again exquisite. You can see that he's one of the better players here in this list. And then also, he simply plays for a team now with Saliba back where you'd expect for them to be a top defense. And Arsenal don't have bad fixtures to start with. Yes, one or two here and there, but we expect them to be a leading defense. And because they were so good away from home as well last season, I just can't see why you wouldn't move away from Gabriel. Now, Zinchenko is an interesting option because as the season progressed before the injuries eventually hit him, he actually had some very interesting improvements in terms of the attacking positions that he was getting into and how many attacks were revolving around him. There were even some set piece chances that were very creative from Arsenal that actually allowed for Zinchenko to take many shots from outside the box. And he eventually did score one of them. Ultimately, when you look at the mix of expected goals and expected assists, he's actually quite a decent option. He does measure up quite well to Gabriel. I'd probably still pick Gabriel, but if you really think that Zinchenko's role will improve, and let's say someone like Declan Rice joining this Arsenal team will improve how much control he can get in that sort of last third, then maybe Zinchenko is actually your pick over Gabriel. As far as Pedro Porro, he's definitely a fantastic option. We talked about how Spurs were actually a team that really underperformed last season when it came to goals conceded. I don't think that that's always going to be a repeat event. I think that it's better to look at expected goals conceded, and still they were a very high quality defense as they were in the previous year when they were under Conte for a full season. And with Pedro Porro coming in with Angie as well coming from Celtic, we actually saw that a lot of the fullbacks within that Celtic team were inverting and they were still very attacking. And this is exactly what Pedro Porro is good at. He's not really a good defender whatsoever. I've seen him defend for Spain and the national team, but you're expecting someone here to actually have really good expected goals and expected assist numbers. I mean, he actually is a standout option here when it comes to the mix of the expected goal involvement. And for that reason, I think Pedro Porro is an exquisite option to look at. But I understand a lot of people have reservations about Spurs because there's going to be a lot of changeover in the team as well as a new manager to think about. As far as Fabian Schär, for me, he's actually still a second tier option in terms of being a great option, just simply because Newcastle have very poor games. I wouldn't really want to start the season with Fabian Schär, but I would easily think about going towards him as soon as game week 5. So this is looking at a player who has fantastic expected goals numbers. Once again, you can see that any player effectively who has more than 0.10 expected goals per 90 is one of the leading options when it comes to defenders within really the top 5 European leagues. So any time you can actually get a player like that, he's probably going to be an interesting option. Given the fact that he plays for this great Newcastle defense, I think he's a fantastic pick later down the season. Saliba is someone that I would avoid just simply because the underlying stats are much worse than Gabriel and Zinchenko. So for that reason, you're really just, looking at probably picking a worse option compared to the two. And for that reason, I would probably avoid Saliba at this point in time. He's more of a differential for me if you really just wanted to go against the crowd. As far as Konate, he's one of the cheaper Liverpool defensive options. He's cheaper than his goalkeeper in Alisson and cheaper than his counterpart in Van Dijk, who of course is slightly better when it comes to set pieces and actually getting chances. Konate is an interesting one where I think he is going to be nailed as we look ahead towards this Liverpool season. But he's not an option that I would think about at this point in time. I just don't think Liverpool's defense are that exciting, and you still have to expect them to make a lot of improvements whilst changing their team significantly. So that's going to have, I think, some growing pains with Konate, so he wouldn't necessarily be an option I'd be looking at from early doors. As far as Moreno, he's an option that I'm extremely interested in. I think he has great expected assist per 90 numbers. You can see here he's clearly one of the top 5 options when it comes to expected assists per 90, level with someone like Robertson, who of course is an exquisite fullback. At 5.0 though, I think he's a touch expensive given the fact that he doesn't play for a top 5, top 6 defense. And yeah, because he also had to share minutes last season, there is a concern where, of course, we saw some games where he was actually subbed off at 55 minutes, and that was actually a little bit of a dampener when you actually look at Moreno. But of course, looking ahead to next season, I do expect him to actually play much more minutes on average, so he could be one to look at when Aston Villa's game run becomes a little bit sweeter. As far as Shaw and Chilwell, we're now looking at the 5.5 options. I think they're the best options by far because, unfortunately, James, I have to put an asterisk over because he's so injury prone, and we saw multiple times this season where he would get injured and re-injured effectively every 2 to 3 to 4 games, and that's a huge question mark as well. He's going to have a preseason behind him, but whether he's actually going to be able to meet the demands of full 90-minute football is something that I would probably be a bit reluctant to say for now. I think it's tempting to start with James because you can clearly see that he has slightly better expected assist per 90 than Chilwell, but I don't think you can go wrong with Chilwell early doors. And the thing with Shaw is he's the absolute nailed United player here. He either plays left center back or left wing back. He still has really good numbers when it comes to expected goals and expected assists, respective for that team, and he also plays for a better defense than Chelsea, at least at this point in time, expecting that someone like Onana will come into the team. So I do think Shaw's a fantastic option. As far as Ruben Diaz and Stones, I'm not so interested in these two players. The issue with City players is that, I mean, you're looking at center backs here, and unfortunately they don't get as many chances as some of the fullbacks do. And for that reason, because they're so expensive and because there's a high chance, of course, when it comes to, let's say, European football early doors, or the way that Pep plays when, let's say, they demolish some teams and he decides to rest some players early, that someone like Stones is very prone to early substitutions, and someone like Ruben Diaz is, I mean, he's an interesting option, but I'd still say probably less interesting than some of the other 5.5, 5.0 options. So that's kind of how I stand with City's defense. Moving on to the premium tier of defenders, I think the early option to put an asterisk over is Robertson. We just simply need to look at what Liverpool are cooking up with the tactical formation early doors to see if, let's say, Robertson's going to play in a back three formation, or if they're even going to, I'd say, bring in another left center back to actually compete in that sort of position with Robertson, where he clearly isn't, perfect for this sort of left center back role if they're trying to enable Trent in the midfield. So that's something to look at, whether this sort of positional change for Robertson is going to further impact him. And we also don't want to jump too far ahead of the curve, because I do think Robertson at 6.5 is really well priced if we expect him to play the minutes that he has in years past. But I can't be so sure about that right now, so I do think he's an early great option. As far as Trippier, just because the run of games at the start of the season is so poor, I just think he's a differential for the time being. But we can easily move towards Trippier later in the season. I think I will expect myself to do that, alongside maybe looking at someone like Fabian Schär instead, who's also really cheaply priced. So I think Trippier is well priced, but because of the run of the games at the start of the season, he's just not one I'm looking at, and for that reason he's a differential. As far as Trent, we do know that there's a lot of power behind that sort of change in position, and I do think we saw at the end of last season how essential he started to become from an FPL point of view, just as a 7.5 asset. And I do think that 8.0 push is fairly priced, given that you now have so much more cost savings in the midfield and some of the other defensive options as well. So if you actually rock with, let's say, 5.0 defensive options, 4.5 options, you can clearly and quite easily afford Trent. And for that reason, I still think he's the best option. We just know that he has the highest ceiling of any defender here. And you can see that with the mix of the expected goal per 90 and the expected assist per 90. And I do think that there's going to be a lot of expectations when it comes to Liverpool improving from what they were performing at last year from a defensive point of view. So even though the expected goals conceded last year was poor, I do think there's scope to say that this Liverpool team can easily improve overall as a defensive unit. Moving on now to the goalkeepers. What I would say here is this is an opportunity to now embrace some of those teams within that tier 3 bracket, because the key thing about goalkeepers is you do benefit from something like saves per 90. And actually, when you look at underlying stats, of course, it's very clear that teams usually in that sort of bottom bracket will actually have keepers that actually have more saves per 90. The reason why, of course, is you'd probably be expecting to concede much less shots on target. If you look at City, for example, and how poor Ederson's saves per 90 numbers are, that's a great illustration of that sort of common effect. On the other hand, you have some fantastic outliers from last season, like Raya, who played for a top 7 defense, but actually conceded a lot of low XG shots in the previous year, which is why he was so high on saves per 90. However, of course, Leno and Pickford being high on saves is a good illustration of that sort of effect, where you're playing for a much weaker defense and therefore suffering from much more shots on target, or even shots in general. So starting with a 4.0 position, we have someone like Areola, who I think could actually become the starting keeper of West Ham this season. We know that Fabianski is that sort of player where if you, let's say, double up with Fabianski and Areola, you can easily cover that West Ham defense, and therefore you'd book yourself by owning, let's say, a top 11, top 12 defense early doors, which I think is actually a very safe strategy to go for. As far as Bentley, he could be someone who actually could take over Jose Sá's position if Jose Sá moves on this season in the transfer market. Bentley was someone that actually got 2 games in the previous season, so I do think that he would be, let's say, the starting keeper of Wolves, and could be an early differential punt, or just someone for you to keep in your team in case, for example, Sá is rumored to move away from Wolves. As far as 4.5, you're looking at Flecken, who I put an asterisk over. The asterisk is simply Raya is still at this point in time still a Brentford player, so we could see Raya start the season as a starting keeper, but Flecken was clearly brought in to be the starting keeper if Raya leaves, and for that reason, I'm putting Flecken as an early best option, expecting that Raya will leave the club. But at this point in time, of course, nothing has sort of crystallized in that sense. As far as Leno, I think he's a fantastic option. Same as Pickford, where they were both playing for very poor quality defenses last season. And there's going to be a huge asterisk with Everton as well, because you can arguably say that Sean Dyche had actually improved Everton, particularly in the attacking phase. However, I don't actually think Everton improved that much defensively after Frank Lampard left. They were actually still a rather poor defense. So I don't want to make that sort of leap in judgment of saying that Everton will be a much better defense this season. But clearly there's scope for Pickford and this Everton team to improve as an asset. So I do think Pickford and Leno are both early doors great options. And the reason why I say that is because even though they were both poor defenses, you still have fantastically high saves per 90 to fall back on, and ultimately Fulham and Everton's fixtures are not particularly bad, so they could be interesting options to go for. Now, John Stone with Crystal Palace is actually someone that I think is tricky to think about, because Crystal Palace keepers, at least in my memory, have never been interesting, but they've actually been bang average. And John Stone is someone that you would actually expect to be the starting keeper for Crystal Palace going forwards, and I don't think there's going to be this sort of crazy rotation between Guaita and John Stone. We actually have confirmation that Hudson is going to be the Crystal Palace manager for another year, so I do think that John Stone being the starting keeper at the end of last season suggests that John Stone could actually be an easy early pick that a lot of people are not thinking about, because still Crystal Palace for the last 2 years were the top 5, were within the top 5 of the expected goals conceded, and there's no reason to say that they won't be a bad defense once again this year. They still have similar players leading the line, but of course Anderson maybe leaving the club is going to be a huge impactful thing for this Crystal Palace team, so we need to stay tuned on that. As far as Burnley, I did talk about how they had exquisite numbers in the Championship, but once again, of course, there's going to be this huge asterisk of moving over to the Premier League. So therefore, the stats that Burnley accumulated as a very good defense last season could dramatically change. One thing I would say, of course, is that there seems to be a lot of confidence in Burnley as well, and they are planning to invest. So that's an early indication that maybe Burnley could be a team to look at as a differential team. But there are so many competing players here and so many good defenses that you can look at, even let's say Brighton, for example, within this tier. And the only reason why Brighton is a differential is simply because I can't really choose who's going to be nailed. Bringing in such a great quality goalkeeper who's actually young suggests that Steele's going to have a lot of competition. As soon as he, let's say, has a bad game or two, I do think he can be dropped, but I do think Steele will start the season. But whether you actually want to start the season with Steele is going to be another question. I do think it might be a bit safer if, let's say, Raya really had left Brentford, to just simply back him instead, because you're still playing for a team that actually, based on the way they play, actually accumulate a lot of shots, which will actually give you extra points. But then also, you're also looking at, let's say, a very similar quality defense when it comes to comparing Brentford and Brighton. As far as Ramsdale at 5.0, he's for me the standout pick, and I really don't think there are any comparable options here. The simple reality is that Arsenal is a much better defense than any of the teams in this list, and Spurs, of course, I mean, Vicario, of course, is a new keeper, but he's in a new situation as well, and I don't think that it's so easy to say that he's immediately going to be a standout pick and Spurs is going to have a fantastic season. I'd much rather at that sort of price, as I said, punt into Pedro Porro. With Ramsdale, it's a question of whether you really want to go with an Arsenal defender, because arguably you could go for him. You could also go for triple Arsenal attack, and that's sort of why so many of the Arsenal options are appealing, but you don't necessarily need to go for all of them, because you can't. And as far as 5.5 plus, I think Alisson's a great pick, simply because I do expect this Liverpool team to improve a lot. However, they still concede a lot of shots, and therefore he becomes quite interesting from a saves point of view. And he is just, I think, actually potentially one of the best shot stoppers in the Premier League. We saw that in the PSXG numbers last year, and I'm expecting for Alisson to have a very similar season again. This is an aspect of football where he's always done well in, so there's no reason to say that Alisson won't be a bad option. But just at 5.5, I don't think I'd really consider him to start as my keeper early doors, and that's sort of why he's only a great option. Ederson, I mean, he could be in a void if you have traumatic memories of Ederson the previous year, but for now I would say he's a differential, simply because at 5.5 I still think it is good value for the best defense in the league. Just City were really struggling to keep clean sheets, whereas if you look at the years past, in terms of 3 to 4 seasons past, they were actually up there in terms of leading the league in clean sheets. If you, let's say, expect things to return to normal and for Arsenal to be as consistent as they were last year over the course of 38 game weeks, and I think Ramsdale's probably the best pick at the slightly more pricey range. And that's sort of my overview of the defenders and goalkeepers, and I hope you guys have a wonderful time. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please do let me know your thoughts on both the defenders and the goalkeepers. I know there's a lot of things to go through, and I hope this video makes sense, but thank you so much for watching.